Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, continuing with female reproductive physiology. Most recently, we talked about the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, the first 14 days when the follicles are growing and developing under the influence of LH and FSH. The theca cells and granulosa cells are doing their jobs. As the follicles and oocytes within them develop, the estrogen level rises due to that hormone production. And although at the beginning of the follicular phase, we have a menstrual period as the old endometrial lining is shed, then in the later part of the follicular phase, we start building a new endometrial lining stimulated by the rising levels of estrogen. So now we're going to move into ovulation and the luteal phase. So you'll recall that at the end of the follicular phase, we had a mature or Graafian follicle in which we had a mature oocyte. That follicle was filled with fluid and ready to burst. So now we're going to ovulate it. Now, how does this happen, right? So it's usually around day 14 in a typical 28-day cycle. And remember, if we don't want to maintain the status quo, if we don't want to maintain homeostasis, we want something new and explosive to happen, we're going to use a positive feedback loop. So instead of the negative feedback system, which keeps things pretty much the same most of the time, maintains things within a narrow range, we're going to want to do something explosive and different. So we're going to get into a positive feedback loop with LH and estrogen. So what's going to happen is at a certain point, as the estrogen level from the end of the follicular phase gets really high, that's going to start to release a lot of LH from the pituitary, which has been storing it up. LH, of course, is going to promote more production of hormones. So then we're going to get more estrogen, which is going to cause more release of LH, and boop, 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 and then right? So we're going to have this huge increase in these hormones through a positive feedback loop. And so what happens then is that causes the granulosa cells that are the wall of the follicle to burst open. All right, so here's my little GIF, right, for positive feedback, right? Something builds and builds and gets higher and higher and bigger until, right, something explosive happens. And so this is a really interesting image that was a woman was having a surgery for a different reason, and the surgeons happened to notice, oh my gosh, look, she's ovulating. So they took a picture. And so let me just show you a few features here. So I'm outlining the ovary. So a human ovary is generally about the size of an almond that's in its shell, which is not something that most of us have familiarity with. So a little bit bigger than an olive, definitely bigger than an olive. Maybe about the size of a shelled walnut, a little bigger than that. But so there's the ovary. And then this right here is the follicle bulging off the surface of the ovary like a pimple that is ready to be popped. Same kind of mechanism here. And then you can see right at that moment she was releasing her oocyte. Now as the oocyte, and here's a close-up view, so as the oocyte is released, it's not just the oocyte itself that comes out of the follicle, it is also the oocyte and the corona radiata, those granulosa cells that were surrounding her. And of course, this is then going to get sucked into the fimbriae of the fallopian tube that are kind of doing their action, and then the ciliated cells in the fallopian tube that are going create that current that's going to pull this oocyte with its corona radiata into and down the fallopian tubes. So ovulation is a big explosive event triggered by a positive feedback loop between LH and estrogen. So there are some physical changes that occur at or shortly after ovulation that can tell you, oh, I must have ovulated. So the first one is changes in the cervical mucus. So you might remember when we learned about the cervix and the cervical os that the inner lining of the cervix produces mucus. That's going to be important for birth control, and it's also relevant here. So that mucus will change consistency. When we get that huge increase in estrogen, as you can see kind of in the bottom of this graph here, it's that gold colored line, that huge increase in estrogen that happens toward the end of the follicular phase will cause the cervical mucus to change in consistency. So instead of being kind of thick and tacky, it starts to get looser, and eventually right around the time of ovulation it gets just like an egg white. So when you crack an egg and you dump it into the bowl and there's that big string of egg white hanging down from the shell, so annoying. Same thing happens with cervical mucus. So if you happen to own a cervix and you happen to have an idea when you might be ovulating, you can insert some fingers into the vagina and touch the surface of the cervix, which feels kind of firm, like the end of your chin or the end of your nose, whereas the rest of the vagina is going to feel kind of soft, like the inside of your cheek. And pull out the fingers and then separate them, as you can see in this cartoon here, and see what happens with that mucus. So if it forms a string like this, that's called a string sign. It means it's really stretchy and gooey, like egg white. Here's a picture of someone, right? This is ovulatory mucus. So this is the change in cervical mucus that happens that can indicate that ovulation is either about to happen or is happening or has just happened. The second physical indicator that some but not all people have, in fact probably fewer than half, is something called Mittelschmerz. This comes from the German and it means middle pain. So we're in the middle of the menstrual cycle, and some people, when that oocyte gets released from the ovary, right when that follicle pops open, some people will feel a little stab of pain that might last for a couple of hours on one side or the other of their pelvis, and they go, oh, what's that? And so some people can actually feel when they're ovulating. They might be like, oh, it's on the left side this month, because it tends to rotate back and forth between the two sides. So cervical mucus changes happen in everybody. Mittelschmerz is something that some people feel, and if they do feel it, it's not necessarily every single month. It depends on where on the ovary, right, sometimes the oocyte is released from. And then the other physical indicator is a change in your basal body temperature. Basal body temperature is your temperature first thing in the morning before you do anything, before you even get out of bed. So if you check your temperature every morning at the same time before you get out of bed and do anything or drink any coffee, you'll find it's pretty consistent from one day to the next. And let's see if I can highlight this. After ovulation, not before, after ovulation, basal body temperature rises almost a degree, and that change in body temperature will persist through the rest of the menstrual cycle until just a couple of days before the next period occurs. So basal body temperature can be a way to find out if you have already ovulated. And interestingly, you can also track that to see if perhaps you have gotten pregnant, because if you do get pregnant, it won't fall back down to normal. It will stay up at the higher level. So kind of cool, some ways you can tell what's going on inside your body. So now we're going to enter the luteal phase. Luteal, you might be like, what does that mean? Why is it called the luteal phase? Is there a good reason? There actually is. So this is days 14 through 28, right? This is the second half of the menstrual cycle. And what happens is that empty follicle here, right? So it just released its oocyte with a corona radiata, turns into a yellow thing. It just so happens that the Latin phrase that means yellow thing is corpus luteum. It sounds much fancier, but so corpus luteum means thing that is yellow, like literally. And the reason why the corpus luteum looks yellow, because when they cut open ovaries, they were like, oh, look, a yellow thing, corpus luteum. The reason why it looks yellow is because it's actually making progesterone, and progesterone is a lipid-based hormone, and so it looks yellow. And so as the corpus luteum, that empty follicle turns into the corpus luteum and starts making progesterone, progesterone levels rise. So that's the green curve here. We can see progesterone levels rise significantly. And that progesterone, that high progesterone then, causes the endometrial lining of the uterus to thicken. It enters what's called the secretory phase. It gets thicker, it gets more blood vessels in it, it starts laying down food storage in the form of different types of sugar molecules. It gets nice and juicy and ready in the hopes that a fertilized egg or a zygote will be coming down the pike and landing in the uterus, right? So it's hoping for a baby, it's hoping for a pregnancy. During the luteal phase, because the corpus luteum is making all of this progesterone, the hypothalamus is like, whoa, there is a lot of hormone around. And so we're going to have negative feedback. So the hypothalamus isn't going to make GnRH, and therefore the pituitary gland isn't going to make LH and FSH. So you can see these are LH and FSH levels up here. They're very low. And so that's kind of a nice little safety mechanism too, because that means we're not going to start the development of and maturation of other follicles and oocytes, right? We're going to kind of wait and see if we get lucky this time. We're going to wait and see if we get pregnant, right? We're going to kind of pause all that follicular development and wait and see what happens. So if we don't get pregnant, so if the egg is not fertilized, if we don't make a zygote, no zygote comes down to land in the uterus, then the corpus luteum just gives up. It's like, all right, well, I tried my best. There's nothing I can do. And so it's going to scar down and form this little white thing. So they named it corpus albicans, or albicans, however you want to say it, which means thing that is white. Okay, so since our corpus luteum has given up the ghost now, progesterone levels are going to fall. As you can see in that green curve, it drops precipitously. And that fall in progesterone level signals the endometrium to break down and slough off, and then will be shed as a menstrual period, and we start the next cycle, right? So then we start the follicular phase of our next cycle with our menstrual period, which is the broken down endometrium from this previous cycle. So it's not surprising that in some people, and in some people more than others, because everyone is different, these really high hormone levels that happen in the week or so before a menstrual period and the really precipitous drop in hormone levels that occurs a few days before the period starts can definitely cause physical symptoms, right? So acne is really common with a high progesterone levels, bloating as well, mood changes, appetite changes, fluid retention, constipation the couple days before you get your period, followed by diarrhea in the first couple days of your period. All of these things are really common, and due to these massive fluctuations in hormonal levels that are occurring in this part of the cycle. So in summary then, so ovulation, we have at the end of the follicular phase a mature follicle and oocyte. That follicle is filled with fluid and ready to pop. We get a positive feedback loop between LH and estrogen where each of them builds until finally the follicle bursts and releases the oocyte. I forgot to list on here the physical manifestations or physical signs associated with ovulation, which would be the change in cervical mucus, that string sign, Mittelschmerz, which happens in some people, and a change in the basal body temperature, which happens after ovulation. Then we enter the luteal phase where that empty follicle, it is not done yet. It still has to keep working. It turns into the corpus luteum and makes progesterone, which then causes that endometrial lining of the uterus to thicken and prepare for a possible pregnancy. If no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum gives up, turns into the corpus albicans, progesterone levels then fall, and that causes the endometrium to break down and slough off and be shed as a period, and we start all over again. All right, so our next mini lecture part will be talking about menses, periods in general. That'll be